Hello, friends. Welcome to episode 3 of the Delgado Podcast, a show featuring academics, authors, artists, and people who challenge the way we think and how to take action. Today, we're chatting with Dr. Jeremy Wade Barrier about his 12-year journey researching ancient manuscripts and writing his latest book, Witch Hunt in Galatia, a book providing a new perspective on ways to read and understand Paul's letter to the Galatians. In today's episode, Dr. Barrier also talks with us about his research studying the Acts of Paul in Thecla, which was an ancient text passed around in the early church, which provided insight into Paul's travels with Thecla, a woman who preached the gospel, baptized people, and was later martyred. It's a fascinating story that shows the faith and preaching power of a woman in the early church, which many people don't know about or may have dismissed entirely. Further on in the episode, Dr. Barrier challenges us to read the Bible with a critical eye and to question those passages that trouble us, especially those discrepancies, contradictions, and other difficult texts that confuse or sometimes even upset us. He also shares reasons why many Christians are resistant to new insights and also scholarship on Scripture, and why it's super important for us to consider the latest research to help us better understand the culture and meaning behind biblical texts. And at the end of today's episode, I share 5 quick takeaways from today's conversation, as well as this week's growth challenge. All right, let's get to part 1 of our discussion with Dr. Jeremy Wade Barrier. So Dr. Jeremy Wade Barrier, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Yeah, no trouble. I appreciate the opportunity.
I saw that you did undergraduate work in mathematics and natural sciences, and I was really curious about what led you to move into studying the Bible and theology.
Well, I guess when I was an undergraduate student, I was actually a dual major, so I was very much getting into Greek classes and theology classes, and at the same time, I was pre-engineering. And so I continued both all the way up to the very end of my undergraduate. And then at that point, it became a practical decision. I realized I could go ahead and finish with a mathematics and natural science degree. And then at that point, I had to decide whether or not I was going to continue down the engineering path in grad school or on the theology path. And I ended up having a professor who sort of tipped the scales for me. And I continued in biblical studies and theology.
That's super cool, because oftentimes I find that people that kind of move into like a seminary or a program where you're going to study the Bible, you have like a humanities background or a languages background. And so it's very unique to have like that mathematics engineering side.
Yeah, that's true. Hopefully it gives me a different perspective. I don't know, but... But I see what you're saying. They do seem to be polar opposites oftentimes.
So I noticed that your new book that just came out called Witch Hunt in Galatia, Magic, Medicine, and Ritual, and the Occasions of Paul's Letters to the Galatians. I read in your introduction that it took you 12 years of research and writing. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. I guess I finished my PhD in 2008. And so during that last year that I was finishing that degree, I was also preparing my dissertation to be published as a monograph, and which ended up happening in 2009. But it was at that time I had decided I really wanted to continue to pursue some other interests that I had. And it was during that time period that I started this study. And really what got me into it was the study of the ancient idea of the evil eye. And so I made the commitment that I really wanted to not continue my academic research like I had to do my dissertation research, which means that I had 2 small children at the time, and my wife and I, we had 2 small kids. And so I was doing most of my research before 6 a.m. and after 8 p.m., and I was working during the day, and which was not enjoyable. So I really wanted to. It also occurred to me that being in the field of theology, if you look at the pay scales in academia, that we and my fellow artists are on the lowest end of the pay scale. So I knew that I really wanted to love what I was doing, or else I wasn't going to fool with it. When I started digging deeper into the subject, I was also not going to be in a hurry about it. I guess what I'm saying is I didn't want to miss the lives of my kids, and I wanted to continue to love what I was doing and just dig into it at my own pace. And so, 3 months turns into a year, turns into 2 years, turns into 12.
Yeah, no,
So,
I mean, that totally makes sense. Like, you have a family and you're trying to balance like your own personal pursuit,
yeah,
studying Galatians, working on this thesis. At the same time, you have a family that you want to be caring for and taking care of, and also not missing all those special moments. So that totally makes sense to
yeah.
me.
In higher ed, and I do think too that higher ed is been trending towards the direction of bankruptcy at several different levels. But one thing that's shifted a lot too is scholars are actually demanded to be publishing frequently. So what that means is just across the board, academics are required to publish more material than they actually have that's probably good, if
Mm.
that makes any sense. Basically, scholars will talk about that's not my best work. That's not my best work. This is something I really cared about. So it's almost like for every 3 things that they're publishing, or every 5 things, only one of them is actually probably really worth the time. And so I thought, well, too, this might be sort of I mean, I think I've been frequently publishing, but I've actually tried to trend in the direction of, well, let me try to do something a little more qualitative instead of quantitative.
Yeah, it seems like very unfair to require that professors need to be constantly publishing because, like you said,
Mhm.
you
Yeah.
can't give priority to everything that you're doing. And professors are also teaching classes, they're doing their own research, and sometimes if you're being forced to put out a paper, yeah, it may not be your best work. So this one was something that you were super passionate about. You wanted to really take your time. And I think also, do you feel like an added pressure when you're writing about the Bible?
I do, in a lot of different directions. I live in Alabama, so what does that mean? People in Alabama, um, it's a very, I guess you could say, traditional way of viewing the Bible and Scripture. Very more often than not fundamentalist. Doesn't matter which religious group you're with. They're pretty hardcore about what they believe, and so that places attention upon me. So, and then on top of that, one thing that I've noticed too, because I've actively been a participant in the Christian church, so I have been actively engaged in ministry as well as academics, and I've noticed that most people who attend church, or at least the people that I've interacted with, most of them already feel like that the Bible is something they already know and they've already mastered it. So when you go into a church, everyone kind of like old news. So the idea of introducing new ideas or from a different perspective isn't taken well. So especially when you're trying to approach writings that some people consider scripture, you're actually looking at them like in this book through the lens of, no, let's look at this as if it's not scripture at all, and let's just look at some 2,000-year-old documents,
Mm-hmm.
letters that we have here, technically speaking, and see what we can make of it.
Yeah.
And so from the start, talking about 2,000-year-old Jewish documents or Jewish writings, that right there is probably more than people would want to accept.
And it's super hard. This is why being a critical reader of the Bible is very difficult because there is so much background, there's so much history, there's the culture aspect that when I come to the Bible in the year 2020, like I'm coming with my American lens in Southern California in the denomination that I grew up in. That's how I'm reading
Mm-hmm.
it. And if I don't have like the proper study tools, if I don't understand the languages, I don't have like understanding of like the culture, the purpose of the book, like it's going to be very hard for me to interpret and make sense of what is actually happening here.
Yeah, I think so. It's in fact that's actually been a little bit of a blessing in disguise. I've found that I don't know. There's almost two different worlds going on, and they're not very closely connected. I'm not quite sure what to make of this at a broader level, but there's academics talking about biblical text, and then there's people in churches talking about it, and the two are not engaging one another very often. I think that the point of engagement probably is through a minister or a pastor, but even that depends on whether or not he has any formal training, where he got his formal training. So what that means is some of these churches are just continuing generation to generation with very little impact from these types of discussion. I do think there is an impact, but oftentimes it might be 20, 30, 50, even 100 years delayed, and it's sort of a trickle-down effect. So, but, I think this is not unique to this field, though. It's the thing that's curious to me is that because we know nothing about battery technology, and we don't really know what's happening in the development of Teslas. That's very current information that we all just sort of, or many of us just assume we're ignorant about it. And whatever they tell us, we're fine with it, we accept it. And that's true of a lot of fields. It's true of medicine, it's true of science. But when it comes to the study of the Bible, it's not something we so quickly accept that there's actually cutting edge information coming out about the Bible. And we felt like, I think many people feel like that whatever we know about it, we've known for quite some time. It's a settled issue. But yet it's actually just as dynamic in the pouring out of new information as any other field would be.
And I feel like sometimes, I guess, like, based on the denomination you're in or the tradition you're part of, you may or may not be willing to accept newer understandings of Scripture.
Yeah, and it's so there, I think what you're tapping into is the fact that there's a general resistance from the start. But on top of that, let me just give an example. Not only is there a resistance to the information, but there is a general lack of information about what's been happening. So let's take, for instance, what I wrote my dissertation on. It was on a writing from the 2nd century called the Acts of Paul and Thecla. And some of the most important manuscripts for the Acts of Paul and Thecla were found in the early part of the 20th century. However, all of these manuscripts were found, and scholars worked on translating and all that kind of stuff, to get it out to the public. However, to this day, there still has not been a publication of a critical text where it gives you the entirety of the Acts of Paul and the Acts of Paul and Thecla. What am I trying to say? This very important early Christian document has yet to be formally and officially presented to the public. In 2020, it still hasn't happened. And the causes for things like this sometimes are quite natural. Back in 2008, I attended a Coptic school in Leipzig, Germany, for about 3 weeks. And one of the things that we learned there was really fascinating to me. If you can bear with this, it won't take me but
no, please.
30 seconds. Why I was there was we were having a Coptic training school to work with ancient manuscripts in Coptic. It's a language. Coptic is an Egyptian language. And so we're working with languages and getting better with these manuscripts. And at the same time, they're using us to work through all of their materials. And so I started to ask the question, why are you needing people to come look through your libraries in Leipzig to go through all of your manuscripts? Well, the reason for that is because most of the manuscripts and handwritten papyri that had come to Leipzig had come around the late 1890s up through about 1930. And it came through one particular scholar who had brought all of it there. His name was Georg Steindorf. Well, Georg Steindorf was a Jew, and as tensions continued to increase in Germany, he realized that he needed to leave. So sometime in the 1930s, he and his family left Leipzig, came to the United States, and then, of course, World War II happened. So on and so forth. Then the Cold War began, and Leipzig just so happens to be in East Germany. So what happened to all the manuscripts that he had brought back from Egypt during his career? They just sat there. They sat there until the 1990s, after the fall of the Berlin Wall. So in the 1990s, new scholars were coming in and starting to go through this stuff. What am I trying to say? There were actually tens of thousands of manuscripts that had barely been looked at in places like Vienna, places like Leipzig, and a number of other libraries. And so it's kind of like, well, just because of the unfolding of history, a lot of this stuff hasn't been looked at, So what does that mean? Well, that means that right now, from the end of the war, I mean the fall of the end of the Cold War, all the way up to the present, as you can imagine, people are more interested in investing money into technology like Google than they are into digging through manuscripts. So there's still a lot to be done. It's just it just takes time.
Yeah, that is fascinating. And it's so cool that you actually got a chance to study some of these manuscripts.
Yeah.
What was
Yeah.
what was that like? Like being able to dig through some of these texts that no one's looked at before.
Oh, it was great. It was really cool. We were divided into 4 groups. One of the groups was actually translating a text about an early Christian saint, maybe martyr, that nobody ever heard of. That was going to be published. It's very specific information, but still, it's pretty cool to see that.
Okay, so as you were kind of going through some of these documents and reading some of these different letters and writings, did it help you? Did it add, I guess, a dimension to your understanding of that culture that was writing letters and passing things back and forth about what they believed God was saying?
Yeah, I think so. In what way? I don't know. I don't know if I could really put my finger on exactly how it was impacting it. I guess it was sort of like a lot of this information. What happens is I don't know. It's kind of like the impact of raindrops upon a garden, where what it actually means to the garden sometimes is difficult to ascertain. But I can't think of any shining examples anyway of directly how it impacted it, other than just the whole general putting the manuscripts in your hands and looking at them, or more strictly under glass. We were holding glass, that encased the manuscripts. Just
Wow.
seeing that
Yeah.
is really interesting. Or
Well,
seeing small bits of book binding, where somebody by hand had used the needle and thread to actually make a book out of the materials. Just things like that are cool.
It's super cool. So one of the books you were looking at was it written by Paul, or people thought it was written by Paul? This Acts text that you're looking at?
Yeah, with my dissertation, there was a book called The Acts of Paul. It's a lot like the book Acts of the Apostles, but it's kind of a separate account. Doesn't quite neatly fit with Acts of the Apostles. And I was looking at just one section of it. One section of it's called The Acts of Paul and Thecla. And probably what's most interesting about the Acts of Paul and Thecla is, number one, Thecla was a female martyr who traveled and worked with Paul, who Paul had commissioned to go and preach and teach. That's very interesting. Secondly, it's our oldest description of what Paul looked like. You can read about that in the text as well. That's really fascinating to see that as well. But between those two things and a couple other odds and ends, it's a pretty fascinating old book.
That's really interesting. What did it say that Paul might look like?
It said that, first of all, he was bald. He had a unibrow, singular brow on his forehead. He had a hooked nose. He was bow-legged, and then it says he had the face of an angel at times.
Interesting.
So
Yeah.
that's a general description of Paul.
Oh,
And most of
interesting.
our early art looks like that. So the earliest image that came out not too long ago from Rome, that's essentially what Paul looks like.
And how cool you got a chance to study some of these texts and look at it under glass. So was it during this time also that as you're looking at these texts that you were also beginning to work on what is now the book Witch Hunt in Galatia?
It was the link between all of it was my interest in Paul and the legacy of Paul. So the Acts of Paul and the Acts of Paul and Thecla are sort of one person's interpretation of Paul into the 2nd century. So I was just kind of curious about him, historically speaking, and his legacy. And then I was also, so that kind of led me off in that direction in my dissertation. And so I kind of put aside this other stuff related to Witch Hunt in Galatia until I was done with that. And then I came back to it because I was just curious about some of the ideas that Paul might have believed and what he was like. And that's kind of what led me into the study that I'm publishing now.
For somebody who never read anything of Paul, never read any of his letters that are in the Bible, what would you say, or how would you describe Paul to this person?
Somebody who has an affection for him. I don't think that he comes across as a very likable person in general. I think he comes across as a very passionate person. He's intensely passionate, and we're looking at letters that he wrote. That's really most of what we have about him. There is the Acts of the Apostles, which gives a narrative account of his movements and his life. But ancient, I'm making an apology for him. Ancient letters in general, they oftentimes will overstate their cases to try to influence people, to persuade them. So what we have are his letters, and he's a fairly harsh person in his style of writing, full of passion, intense. He does have rich feelings about how people behave. He's very much into shaping the morality of churches he's involved in. He feels like it is his job to shape these churches that he's put together. And of course, 2,000 years ago, all of his ideas about the roles of men and women are not the same as we would view them today. And so that comes out harshly in the text. And I think people have really pinned him to the wall on that. However, there are moments of what I would consider just extreme brilliance and loftiness in some of the ideas, especially when he starts talking about ideas like love or the magnificence of God. Just beautiful, beautiful poetry.
I like that description. I love that. And from my understanding, Galatians and maybe even First Thessalonians were written prior to the Gospels. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's right. It's been argued. I don't think it's not conclusive amongst scholars, but Galatians is potentially the earliest writing of early Christianity. It's the earliest Christian writing we have. However, most scholars, I think, would say that Thessalonians was written before that. So it's definitely one of the first two or three writings that we have of early Christianity. Of course, this is looking at it through a historical lens when you can actually date them. And of course, this assumes a dating of the Gospels probably at the earliest in the 60s. And so Galatians is probably dated to the early 50s, something like that. Late 40s for Thessalonians. So, yeah, this is actually our earliest glimpse of what you and I would call Christian. And what's fascinating about that is that if we're really honest about the text, it's not actually an early representation of Christian. It's actually Judaism in the first century. What do you mean by that, Jeremy? Well, it's kind of like what we do know is this was a Jew writing it. And if we want to know, let me give you an example. If we want to know anything about Pharisaic Judaism in the middle of the first century, the Apostle Paul is actually our most authoritative source on the subject. We don't really have any other writings of Pharisaic Judaism during this time period outside of Paul. What we do have, though, is someone who is a member of within Judaism who had just so happened to accepted that this person whose name was Jesus was the Jewish Messiah. So when we look back in time, from where we are today, we of course say this is the earliest Christian writings we have. But at the time, this is not what we would have called this. In fact, Paul never even uses the term Christian. He may not have even been familiar with the term. So so we don't see it in his writings at all. So kind of fascinating to think about it like that. So the earliest references to the term Christian, as best we can determine, date to after the death of Paul. So it's not certain whether he was familiar with these terms or not. He may have been at some point, but we don't really have any evidence to suggest that or to prove it.
And it's interesting, too, that knowing that maybe Galatians is one of the first documents we have from Paul and one of the first books for the New Testament, like that book that you studied is also I feel like one of the harshest books from Paul.
Yeah, it is. It is. And I think that kind of goes into what I was talking about with Paul using his writings to persuade people. And in fact, one of the most interesting things about the letter to Galatians is when Paul starts the letter, he appears to be starting it like he does his other letters. However, about 2 or 3 lines into a letter, Paul will usually have some type of thanksgiving prayer that he offers up to the people he's writing to. In Galatians, he does not. He basically starts out with a curse, and he does it twice. So some scholars have even made the guess, which is a pretty good one, that Galatians as a whole was never intended to be just a friendly letter to a church. It was actually written specifically to be somewhat of a magical curse. If you think of it that way, it really, it kind of changes the whole impression that you have about what the letter is supposed to be to begin with.
Okay, I want to ask you about that because it is funny that I was actually reading through this Oxford commentary in the Bible, and it talks about how the Book of Galatians, like there's like 3 big points where Paul's like, oh, you foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you? And then there's the thing at the end, I wish those who unsettle you would emasculate themselves. Like there's some very harsh language, right, in Galatians, and it's nothing like the comforting books of like Timothy, right, where it's like, oh, how loving he is towards Timothy. And so like when you read those books, it's like, oh, what a compassionate, loving man, this Paul, like just caring for this young Timothy. But then you read this first book of Galatians, and it's like, you foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you? I wish those who unsettle you would emasculate themselves. Like, what happened? Who's this Paul that I'm reading Galatians?
Yeah, that's right. It's extremely harsh. I mean, when we put on our 21st century glasses, calling someone to emasculate themselves, is he really calling violence into their community? And this is where, if this is where understanding that it is a letter, and if you understand the overall themes of the letter, all of a sudden it begins to make a little bit more sense. It's, because it's kind of like what we would think of as a public presentation by a political figure, where it may not be fair for us to develop a theory of their person or their personal habits, maybe at a certain level, but it's actually a rhetorical composition for a specific purpose. Well, that's what we have here with this letter too. And it just so happens that the major theme of the writing of Galatians is that he's basically saying you must not circumcise any of the Gentile members. So he plays with that idea a lot, maybe plays with it in what we would consider inappropriate ways, like with the comment about emasculation. But that becomes a theme. It's a theme of the entire letter. And so that's where it becomes important to realize that it's kind of, I think 2,000 years ago, they probably would have picked up and understood what he was getting at a lot quicker than we're able to. That therein lies the problem. And once again, I think that what we're doing here is we're actually looking at this letter as a writing from 2,000 years ago, and rather than just immediately thinking that this text can speak to us directly in the 21st century. And that's where I'm kind of saying, no, there needs to be a pause. If you're going to do that, you need to really have some type of appreciation for a context, and because it's quite different.
And I want to ask you about your comment about the magic eye. I would love to hear more about that, because that's something I never heard before. A lot of times when I've read things about Galatians, it mainly focuses on the doctrine about Paul's arguing for justification by faith. That's the clear message. You don't need the law. That's kind of the main theme of Galatians. So share with me this perspective with magic.
Once again, there are a number of things that we have preconceived notions about. One of them is that there's actually a whole storyline that goes with this, but that is, there's a belief that magic is not a part of Judaism. Okay, never has been. And in fact, if you read some of these texts from the Hebrew Bible, you'll even see, I think that they were even asked in ancient Israel if there were sorcerers, that sorcerers were worthy of being put to death, things like that. So there's this idea that within ancient Israel or early Judaism that they don't do magic. Well, that's actually part of their own rhetoric. fighting against it. But the truth of it is that there are lots of versions of Judaism, or you could even extend that to Christianity, that have components of magic within them. And so I was really curious about this idea about whether or not Paul really was throwing down a curse against the Galatians. I mean, in the full implications of magic. And then in chapter 3, when we do have this line, "O foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you?" Well, literally, who has given you the evil eye? Who has put a curse on you, cursed you through their eyes? There's a whole massive thing related to that, which is a pretty big part of the book. But what was fascinating about this is that from Paul's point of view, it sounds like that he thought that somebody had come into Galatia after he had started those churches, and from Paul's point of view, had put some type of curse on them and clouded their vision, and they can no longer see clearly, and they were starting to do things that was bothering Paul. So then Paul comes in and writes this letter, Galatians, and it looks like it might be a counter curse. So, and when he says, "Who has bewitched you," or "Who has given you the evil eye," the question is, does Paul really believe that someone did curse them? And I think when you start to unfold this, there's actually a cultural script all around this idea. And when you start to unfold it, you begin to realize that I really think Paul did believe that someone had come in and put a curse upon that church, and so it's part of his responsibility to undo that curse. And but just that whole idea of thinking about Paul in that way within certain realms of Christianity or Judaism was sort of taboo. But sometimes it's like the evidence is looking at you and it's trying to scream at you and say, "Hey, I just talked about a curse here. That's what I'm really talking about here." But what oftentimes ends up happening is scholars will whitewash that and they'll call it, "Oh, that's just metaphorical. He didn't really mean that. He's just using that as a metaphor or an analogy." And what was really curious to me is I started to go back and look at a history of interpretation of that passage about the bewitchment or the cursing. And what you see is for over a millennia, you see both interpretations. All throughout the early history of the church in the Byzantine era, all the way up to the Middle Ages, where people commenting on this text, some really did believe it was a cursing. Others were like, not so sure about that. Even up to Martin Luther. Martin Luther very much believed that there was a demonic dimension that Paul was countering in the letter, and he saw this as a live counter curse. But what happened that was fascinating was after the Enlightenment period, so we're talking about the 1800s, early 1900s, there were several commentaries that came out that were very definitive in their historical analysis of the text, and they were certain that Paul would not be offering up a true, genuine counter curse against a curse. Why? Because Paul wouldn't have believed in such things. And so, roughly 100 years ago, we had a heavy push away from this idea that Paul could have been mystical about it.
Okay, we're going to pause right here, and we'll continue our conversation with Dr. Jeremy Wade Barrier in part 2, where he talks with us about how to choose the proper study tools for studying the Bible, ways for us to read the Bible devotionally, and what to do with those passages that don't agree with us. So that's next time. And before we go, I want to share with you 4 takeaways from today's discussion, as well as this week's challenge. Number 1, the book of Galatians isn't a letter of love and affection. It's a bombshell. Paul is ticked. He's super upset because the churches that he helped establish in Galatia were moving away from righteousness by faith and starting to believe that righteousness could come through works of the law, especially circumcision. He calls the Galatians stupid for thinking this way and wishes that people circulating these false doctrines would be emasculated. Paul is furious. Upset. Number 2, it's important to be a critical reader of the Bible. That means asking questions. It means that you're not always going to agree with everything that you're reading. That's a healthy way of viewing Scripture, and it's a healthy way of dealing with those really troubling bits. Number 3, let's be curious about the latest research on the Bible. The latest scholarship can help us improve our knowledge of the Bible as well as the cultural background and meanings of the text. When you encounter texts that upset you or don't make sense, realize that these ancient writings were written for a specific culture and had a specific purpose in mind. You don't have to agree or disagree, but you should question the meaning. And number 5, Paul gives us an example of what a passionate life looks like. I mean, he was all in, 100% committed to preaching the gospel, launching churches, and nurturing their growth. He wasn't perfect and obviously had some very hurtful views, but he was trying his best to help others in their spiritual journey. And I think that's very encouraging. So, this week's challenge is pretty simple. I want to encourage you all to take 20 minutes to read the Book of Galatians. Yeah, it's a very short book. It just takes 20 minutes to read. And I think what's important about Galatians is that it's one of the earliest writings that we have of the New Testament church. And it gives us insight into the mind of Paul and also some of the challenges that the early church had in understanding how the law of God should be used. And when you're done, write a few sentences down on what you think of Paul and this letter. Could he have been more compassionate, more loving? I'm really curious in your thoughts. Let me know in the comments or message me on Instagram or Twitter. You can find me at Delgado Podcast. Oh, and if you found this podcast helpful in any way, please let me know by rating the show on iTunes and or leaving a comment. Your vote can help the show get more visibility. Thank you so much, and we'll talk next week. Take care.